Fresh coffee drifted through the air. People moved quickly, heads down, lost in their own worlds, and yet every so often, someone would pause to look around as if searching for something they couldn't name. Into this busy, slightly chaotic scene stepped a young man carrying a small wooden easel and a well-used sketch pad. He didn't rush and he didn't push through the crowd like everyone else. Instead, he walked slowly, almost as if he were taking the city in one detail at a time. His clothes were simple, a plain shirt, jeans, and a pair of sneakers. But there was something about him that made people notice him, even before he said a word. Maybe it was the way he held his sketch pad, or the calm determination in his eyes. He stopped in front of a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a tiny florist. The cafe had an old charm, with yellow walls and hand-painted signs, the kind of place where people came to sit for hours with a cup of coffee and a book. Today it was busy but not crowded. The tables near the windows were occupied by people typing on laptops or chatting quietly. The smell of freshly baked bread mixed with strong coffee, making the place feel warm and inviting. The young man took a deep breath, set up his easel, and began to unpack his pencils. One by one, he laid them out neatly, sharpening a few with careful precision. He didn't rush, and his movements were calm and purposeful, as if he had done this 100 times before. Then he looked around the cafe, scanning the room slowly. His eyes settled on a young woman sitting alone, sipping her coffee and reading a book. He smiled politely and approached her. "Excuse me," he said softly, holding up his sketch pad. "Can I draw you for dinner?" The woman blinked. For a moment, she wasn't sure if he was joking or serious. A few seconds passed, and then she laughed. "For dinner? You mean like a date?" she asked, half teasing, half curious. The young man shook his head with a smile. "No, not a date. I just mean, can I draw you while you enjoy your coffee?" She tilted her head, studying him. There was something genuine about his tone, something that made her feel at ease. Most strangers who approached her in a cafe would have seemed awkward or pushy, but not him. His request was unusual, yes, but it wasn't intrusive. It was simple, almost innocent, and there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes. "Okay," she said finally, laughing softly. "I guess you can try." The young man nodded, thanked her, and pulled up a small stool next to her. He opened his sketch pad to a fresh page and picked up a pencil. For the first few moments, he just watched her. The way she held her cup, the slight tilt of her head, the way her hair fell over her shoulder. Then his pencil began to move. The lines were light at first, almost tentative, but there was confidence beneath them. With every stroke, the sketch started to take shape. People nearby glanced over curiously. Some smiled, thinking it was just a harmless little scene, someone sketching a stranger in a cafe. Others whispered quietly to each other, intrigued by how calm and focused the young man seemed. The woman watched in silence, fascinated. She had seen artists at work before, but there was something different about this young man. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't showing off. He was simply observing. He captured the curve of her smile, the way her eyes seemed to light up when she laughed, the subtle gestures that made her unique. Within minutes, the sketch started to feel alive, almost like it could move off the page at any moment. When he finally set down his pencil, he showed her the page. She leaned closer and gasped softly. The sketch looked just like her, but somehow more vibrant, more real. It wasn't just a copy of her face. It was her expression, her energy, the little details that made her herself. She looked up at him, eyes wide, and found him smiling back at her. "Wow," she said quietly. "That's amazing." "Thank you," he replied, shrugging modestly. "I just like capturing moments. People are interesting, and I like seeing them smile before they even know what's happening." Her friends at a nearby table had been watching, and now they leaned in, curious. "Can you draw us too?" one of them asked, grinning. He nodded politely. "Sure, if you'd like. It will just take a few minutes for each person." One by one, he moved around the cafe, offering his sketches to anyone willing to sit for him. At first, people laughed, thinking it was just a fun little thing. But as they saw his work, the laughter gave way to quiet awe. He drew a man reading a newspaper, a young couple sharing a pastry, an elderly woman sipping tea by the window. Each sketch was full of life, capturing not just the features of his subjects but their moods, their small gestures, the essence of who they were. The cafe began to change. It was still busy, still filled with the usual chatter, but there was a sense of wonder in the air. People who had been absorbed in their phones looked up. People who had been lost in their own thoughts smiled and laughed. A few whispered to each other, nodding, pointing quietly. There was something magnetic about the young man. And though nobody knew it yet, there was something familiar about him too. As he worked, he noticed people taking out their phones, snapping pictures of the sketches or of him in action. Some whispered guesses about who he might be. His calm, focused presence made them curious. He didn't speak much beyond polite introductions and gentle questions, but his eyes, the way he held the pencil, and the way he connected with each person felt different. After a while, he returned to the woman who had first agreed to be drawn. She held her sketch and looked at him again. "I can't believe how good this is," she said. "It's like you see people differently than anyone else." He smiled just slightly. "I like to notice things others might miss. A smile, a glance, a little gesture. Everyone has something worth capturing." The woman nodded, still staring at the sketch. "You're really talented. Are you an artist?" He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I guess you could say that. But not like the famous ones you see in museums. I just enjoy drawing people." Unbeknownst to the woman and the other patrons, there was a deeper truth. He was the son of a world-famous painter, someone whose name was known in galleries and auction houses across the globe. His father's paintings hung in museums, and some had sold for more money than most people could imagine in a lifetime. But the young man didn't carry that fame with him. He wasn't here to impress anyone or to use his father's name. He simply loved people and loved art, and he loved capturing the little moments that often went unnoticed in the rush of daily life. A few hours passed, and the cafe continued to hum with energy. People came and went, and yet the sketches remained, scattered across tables handed to their owners like tiny treasures. Laughter and chatter filled the space, and for a little while, the city outside felt a bit slower, a bit warmer, a bit more human. Finally, the young man packed up his easel and sketch pad. He stood at the door, looking back at the cafe one last time. People waved, smiled, some even called out to him, thanking him for the sketches. He nodded politely, returned the smiles, and stepped out into the city, blending into the crowd once more. For those who had been drawn, it was an unforgettable afternoon. They had met a stranger, shared a simple moment, and left with a memory captured on paper. None of them knew his name, and yet they felt as if they had known him for much longer. As he walked down the street, sketchpad under his arm, he thought about the next place he might go. There were more people to meet, more faces to capture, more little moments to preserve. For him, art wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection, about noticing the beauty in ordinary lives, about making strangers pause for a moment and smile. And so, the young man disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind sketches, laughter, and a quiet reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones who choose to stay ordinary, at least until the world notices. After leaving the cafe, the young man walked through the streets slowly, letting his mind wander as much as his steps. The city was alive in a way he loved. The chatter of people walking by, the smell of street food mixed with the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day, and the occasional laughter of children playing in a nearby park. Every detail mattered to him, every tiny gesture, because he saw the world as a canvas waiting to be sketched. He found a small park bench under a large tree, whose leaves were starting to turn golden with the early signs of autumn. He sat down and opened his sketchpad again. Today, he decided, he would focus on capturing ordinary people in extraordinary moments. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about seeing them, really seeing them. Across from him, a man was playing with his young daughter. She wore a bright red coat and ran around laughing while he tried to keep up with her. The father's face was full of joy, and every once in a while he would glance down at his daughter with a soft, protective smile. The young man picked up his pencil and began to draw. He didn't just draw their faces, he drew the movement, the energy, the warmth that radiated from them. When he finished, he felt as if he had caught a piece of that happiness on the page. The city was alive that afternoon. Cars honked in the distance, a few street performers played music on the corners, and the smell of nearby an elderly woman sat feeding pigeons. She had a quiet smile, and her eyes held decades of stories. The way she tossed crumbs, careful not to startle the birds, fascinated him. He sketched her slowly, taking his time to notice the way her hands moved, the slight tilt of her head, and the gentle wrinkles that told of years filled with laughter and sorrow. When he showed her the sketch, her eyes widened in surprise. "Oh my," she said softly. "That's me?" "Yes," he replied. "But it's not just your face. It's how you move, how you care for the little things. It tells a story about you." She looked down at the sketch, then back up at him. "You have a gift," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "You see more than most people ever will." He smiled quietly and nodded as if to say, "Thank you," but he didn't want to talk too much. He didn't need to explain. His work and the reactions it evoked said everything for him. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, more people began to notice him. Some approached, curious about the quiet man sketching everyone around him. They watched him work, some smiling, some simply fascinated. A few even asked if they could be drawn. At first he hesitated, unsure if it was polite to impose, but when he looked at their faces, curious, hopeful, maybe even a little nervous, he nodded and gestured for them to sit. A young man who was jogging around the park stopped, intrigued. "Wait, you want to draw me?" he asked, slightly out of breath. "Only if you're okay with it," the young man said calmly. "I like capturing people as they are, not posed or forced." The jogger laughed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Why not? This will be interesting, I guess." He sat on a nearby bench, and within minutes the sketchpad came alive with his likeness. But it wasn't just a simple portrait. The young man captured the motion of his running, the energy, the slight exhaustion mixed with determination. When the jogger saw the finished sketch, he laughed and shook his head. "That's incredible. I've never seen myself like this," he admitted. "It feels real. Not just my face, but me." The young man nodded politely. "Everyone has a story. I just try to notice it." By now, a small crowd had gathered, curious about the quiet artist working under the tree. Some whispered to each other, pointing at him and his sketchpad. "Look at the detail," one said. "Who is this guy? He's amazing." One woman pulled out her phone, zooming in on the sketches. He looks familiar," she whispered to her friend. "Like, I've seen him somewhere before." Her friend shook her head. "No, it's just the way he draws. Look at his hands, how calm he is. He's different." That was when someone else in the crowd muttered the words that would spread quickly. "Isn't he the painter's son? The famous one?" The whisper moved through the small group like wildfire. People leaned closer, trying to get a better look at him, trying to confirm if the quiet young man with the sketchpad was really who they thought he was. A few even pulled out their phones, quickly searching for images online. There it was, a picture that confirmed it. He was the son of a world-famous painter, the same artist whose work was displayed in galleries all over the world, whose paintings sold for millions, whose name everyone recognized. But he didn't act differently. He didn't hold his head higher or try to draw attention to himself. He continued sketching, calm and focused, as if he were completely unaware of the stir around him. People watched, amazed. Some felt starstruck, others felt admiration, but everyone felt something. An unexpected connection to someone who could have been distant, famous, untouchable, yet was right there, drawing them with quiet attention and respect. The atmosphere shifted. What had been casual curiosity became awe. People who had been chatting, laughing, or simply passing by now watched silently. They wanted to see him work, to see the sketches come to life under his skilled hands. He had captured attention not with words, not with fame, but with quiet, undeniable talent. The young man noticed some of the whispers but didn't let them distract him. He approached a small group of teenagers who had been giggling nervously, unsure if they could really be drawn. "Would you like me to sketch you?" he asked politely. They hesitated, unsure, then nodded shyly. He gestured for them to sit, and within minutes their faces appeared on the page, full of life and personality. The teenagers were amazed. "That's... wow," one of them whispered. "It's like you can see inside us." He smiled politely. "I just noticed things others might miss," he said softly. "Everyone has something special, something worth capturing." By now, people had started to gather around him more openly. Some were excited, some were curious, some just wanted to watch him work. It was a rare moment when a city park felt alive with quiet wonder, not chaos. The young man's presence had shifted the energy. It wasn't about him as the son of a famous painter. It was about what he was doing, the way he saw people, and the way he made them feel. Even those who didn't sit for a sketch were affected. A man walking his dog stopped, watching from a distance. A woman paused with her groceries, drawn in by the quiet intensity of his work. Children tugged at their parents' hands, pointing at him and whispering excitedly. Everyone in their own way was noticing, feeling, and appreciating something they rarely took the time to notice, the simple, beautiful details of life around them. A journalist who had been passing by on her way home noticed the growing crowd. She approached cautiously, notebook in hand. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you the young man who is drawing all these people?" He looked up briefly, smiled politely, and nodded. "Yes," he said, "but I'm just drawing people. Nothing more." The journalist paused, studying him carefully. You're the son of the famous painter," she said. "Is that true?" He nodded, still calm, still humble. "Yes, but I'm not here because of that. I just like capturing moments, noticing the little things that people don't always see. Fame doesn't interest me. Connection does." Her eyes widened. She scribbled in her notebook furiously. This is incredible. People are mesmerized by the way you work. It's not just talent, it's something more, something human." He nodded politely, then returned to his sketches, ignoring the growing attention. He wasn't doing it for the recognition, and he wasn't doing it for the fame. He was doing it because he loved people, because he loved art, and because he loved seeing moments that might otherwise be lost. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the park, the young man had sketched dozens of people. Each sketch was unique, each one full of life, full of humanity, full of connection. The crowd slowly dispersed, some carrying sketches, some taking pictures, but all carrying a sense of awe and wonder at what they had just witnessed. He packed up his easel, thanked those who had sat for sketches, and started walking again, disappearing into the city crowd. Yet the energy he left behind lingered, the laughter, the quiet smiles, the whispers of awe. People would talk about this day for a long time, about the mysterious young man who drew them not as strangers, but as individuals with stories, moments, and beauty worth capturing. For the young man, the day wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about being famous or living in the shadow of his father. It was about noticing, seeing, and connecting. It was about giving people a moment of themselves they could hold on to. And for the city, for a little while, the ordinary had become extraordinary. Next morning, the young man woke early as he always did. The city was quiet then, with only a few early risers walking briskly to catch their trains or buses. The smell of fresh bread from corner bakeries drifting through the streets, and the occasional sound of a car starting in the distance. He liked mornings because they felt full of possibilities, unhurried and untouched by the chaos that would come later. He carried his sketch pad and a small bag of pencils, heading toward a part of the city he hadn't explored before. Narrow streets lined with small shops and old apartments always fascinated him. There was something about the way life settled in these quieter corners that made them perfect for his work. People moving at their own pace, moments that might otherwise go unnoticed. Soon he arrived at a small square. There was a fountain in the center, its water sparkling in the early sunlight. A few people were seated on benches around it, reading newspapers, sipping coffee, or just watching the world go by. A street musician played softly nearby, the notes of a guitar carrying through the air. It was the kind of place that felt alive but peaceful at the same time, a perfect canvas for his sketches. He set up his easel near the fountain, laying out his pencils and sketch pad carefully. Then he looked around as he always did, scanning the square for someone whose presence seemed to invite observation. His eyes settled on a woman sitting on a bench, her small notebook open in her lap. She was quietly writing, occasionally pausing to look at the fountain or the people passing by. Her focus on the little things around her drew him in, and he quietly approached. "Excuse me," he said softly, holding up his sketch pad. "May I draw you while you write?" The woman looked up, surprised, and studied him for a moment. There was nothing about him that demanded attention, yet something about the calm, respectful way he spoke made her relax. "Sure," she said finally, a small smile tugging at her lips. He pulled up a small stool and began sketching. As always, he didn't just draw faces. He captured the way her hands moved over the notebook, the subtle tilt of her head when she concentrated, the quiet rhythm of her breathing as she focused. It was as if he were recording not just her appearance but the very essence of the moment, the stillness, the thoughtfulness, the peaceful energy that surrounded her. People began to notice him again. Some whispered quietly to each other, pointing toward the sketch pad. A man walking his dog slowed down, curious. A child playing near the fountain stopped and stared, fascinated by the gentle way the young man worked. The scene drew attention, but it wasn't the kind of attention that was loud or disruptive. It was quiet admiration, almost reverence for someone who could see so much in what others might overlook. As he worked, more whispers began to spread. Some people remembered the small park sketches from the previous day. Others recognized him from photos online. The fact that he was the son of a world-famous painter had begun circulating quietly, and now more and more people were starting to put the pieces together. "Isn't that him?" someone whispered to a friend. "The painter's son?" "Yes, the friend replied, nodding. "That's definitely him. I saw an article online yesterday." People were talking about him drawing in the park. The young man heard the whispers but didn't react. He kept his attention on the woman's notebook, on the way her hair caught the morning light, on the small details that made the moment special. Fame didn't matter to him. Recognition didn't matter. What mattered was the connection he felt to the people he sketched and the small, ordinary moments that were often overlooked. The woman looked up occasionally, watching him work. "You make it look so simple," she said softly. "But it's incredible. You see things no one else notices." He smiled quietly. "I just pay attention. That's all." As the morning turned into late morning, the square began to fill with more people. Street vendors set up small stalls with fruits, flowers, and handmade crafts. Tourists wandered in, snapping photos and marveling at the small fountain in the center. Some of them noticed him and paused, curious about the young man sketching quietly near the bench. A couple approached, holding hands, watching him with interest. "Do you draw people often?" the woman asked. He nodded. "I like to capture moments. People are fascinating even in the smallest gestures." The man smiled. "You're really talented. Most artists we see, they only paint faces or landscapes. You capture life itself." He shrugged modestly, not wanting to draw attention to himself. "I just notice what's around me," he said. That's all. By now the crowd had grown noticeably. Some people who had passed by without recognition the day before now whispered, "That's him, the painter's son." Others quietly searched online, confirming the truth. He was famous by association, yet he carried himself with a humility that made people feel comfortable, not starstruck. A young boy, no older than 8, approached nervously. He clutched a small toy in his hand and looked up at the young man shyly. "Can you draw me too?" he asked, voice barely audible. The young man nodded and gestured for him to sit. He sketched quickly but with care, capturing the boy's wide eyes, messy hair, and playful expression. When the boy saw the finished sketch, he gasped with delight. "This is amazing," he said, holding the page carefully. "It looks just like me." "Of course," the young man replied, smiling softly. "But it's also how you feel right now. That's part of the picture, too." Parents nearby watched quietly, amazed at how the young man could connect with children and adults alike. There was something about his presence that put people at ease, that made them want to sit, to pause, to allow themselves to be seen. As the morning wore on, the whispers of his parentage grew louder. People began to pull out phones, taking pictures discreetly. Others tried to catch glimpses of him in action, fascinated by the contrast between his quiet demeanor and the skill evident in every stroke. Some people who had known of his father's fame admitted quietly to themselves that they hadn't expected this. The humility, the gentleness, the human warmth. A woman who had been watching from a distance finally approached. You're the son of the famous painter, right?" she asked softly. He nodded, keeping his eyes on his sketch pad. "Yes," he said. "But that doesn't change what I do. I'm here to draw people, not to be famous." Her eyes widened. "It's incredible. You could have been using your father's name, doing gallery shows, making money. But you're just noticing people, capturing life." He smiled faintly. "That's the only thing that matters. Fame doesn't mean anything if you lose the connection to the world around you." By now, a small crowd had gathered around him. Some people who had seen him in the park the day before joined the square, excited to witness his work again. Children, adults, tourists, and locals alike all watched as he moved from person to person, sketching quietly, giving each subject the same careful attention. People began sharing the sketches with each other, pointing out details they hadn't noticed at first. How a hand was drawn, the tilt of a head, the way a smile felt alive on the page. Some took photos, others simply stared, absorbing the quiet magic of the moment. The young man's focus never wavered. He didn't speak much, but his work spoke for him. Every sketch was a small story, a frozen moment of life, a reflection of the beauty in the everyday. People began to feel something shift inside themselves, a quiet realization that ordinary moments could be extraordinary if someone took the time to notice them. By noon, the sun had risen higher, casting warm light across the square. The fountain sparkled, children laughed as they played, and people paused in their busy lives to watch a young man with a sketchpad, quietly transforming the ordinary into something remarkable. He looked around briefly, noting the energy of the square, the faces of people he had captured, and the small crowd that had gathered. He packed up a few sketches, careful not to damage them, and gave them to their owners. Each person received the sketch with surprise, delight, and gratitude. Some people whispered softly, "I'll treasure this," while others laughed with joy, holding the pages carefully. As he began to leave, the crowd murmured among themselves. They had witnessed something unusual, something memorable. It wasn't just that he was talented. It wasn't just that he was the son of a famous painter. It was the way he noticed people, the care with which he treated them, the quiet magic of his presence. For a few hours, the ordinary world had become extraordinary, and people felt lucky to have been part of it. He walked down the narrow streets, blending into the city crowd once more. The whispers of his fame would follow him, and some people would share the story widely, amazed that someone so closely related to greatness could be so humble and so human. But he didn't think about that. He thought only about the next moment, the next person, the next sketch. For him, life was a series of small, precious moments. Fame could not capture them. Only attention, only care, only seeing them as they truly were could preserve their beauty. And that was what he lived for, quietly, humbly, and completely. The following afternoon, news of the young man's sketches had begun to spread across the city. People who had witnessed him in the park and the square talked quietly about him to friends and family. Social media posts started appearing, showing some of the sketches, praising his talent and hinting at the fact that he was the son of the famous painter. But despite the growing attention, the young man moved through the city as if none of it mattered. He found himself in a narrow alley lined with small cafes and little art shops. The sunlight filtered through the gaps between buildings, casting a golden glow on the cobblestones. He loved these quiet streets. They had character. They held secrets. They had stories waiting to be noticed. Setting his bag down near a small cafe with a few tables outside, he opened his sketchpad once more. A few people were seated at the tables, sipping coffee and chatting quietly. One older man with a neatly trimmed beard was reading a book, occasionally glancing at the street as if observing life without wanting to be noticed. A young woman with a scarf loosely wrapped around her neck sipped her tea, watching the city go by. A small boy tugged at his mother's hand, looking at a street cat that had appeared on the sidewalk. Each of them, in their own way, offered a small moment waiting to be captured. The young man set up a chair and began to sketch. He didn't rush, as he rarely did. His pencil moved deliberately, capturing the small details, the tilt of the older man's head, the way the young woman's fingers wrapped around her cup, the cautious curiosity of the small boy as he observed the cat. Each line he drew was thoughtful, full of care and alive with life. People began to notice again, as they always did. A few cafe patrons leaned slightly forward, curious about the quiet artist in their midst. Others passing by slowed their steps, intrigued. Whispers started to spread, soft at first, then louder. "Isn't that... could it really be... the painter's son?" By now more people recognized him. A small crowd gathered without even realizing it, drawn by the quiet focus of his work. There was something magnetic about him, not loud or demanding, but calm, skilled, and deeply human. Unlike many famous people, he didn't push himself into the spotlight. He didn't try to impress anyone. He simply drew, paying attention, noticing life where others rushed past. One of the cafe owners, a cheerful woman in her 50s, approached cautiously. "You're the artist's son, aren't you?" she asked softly. He nodded, not looking up from his sketchpad. "Yes," he said quietly, "but I'm just here to draw people. That's all." Her eyes widened. "You have a gift. Most people only notice the big things. You notice the little things that matter. It's beautiful. He smiled faintly, appreciative but modest. That's what I love about it, he said. The small moments. They're often more meaningful than the big ones. Meanwhile, the crowd grew. People from the street stopped to watch him work. Tourists leaned on nearby railings, trying to glimpse the sketches. Children pointed excitedly at the pages, noticing details in the drawings that seemed almost magical. Adults whispered to each other, impressed not only by the talent but by the quiet, respectful way he treated each person he drew. A man who had been sitting quietly at a table for some time finally spoke. "You don't act like you should," he said. "Most people with your last name, they would want attention. They would want everyone to know who they are. But you just draw. You just notice. That's rare." The young man nodded politely. "I'm not interested in attention," he said softly. "I'm interested in people, life, moments that are real, not staged." At that moment, a young woman approached, holding a small child in her arms. "Could you draw him too?" she asked, looking at him hesitantly. He smiled gently. "Of course," he said, gesturing for them to sit. The child wriggled nervously but gradually relaxed under his careful observation. Within minutes, the sketchpad came alive with the child's wide eyes, tiny hands, and the faint, mischievous grin that revealed a lively spirit. When the mother saw the finished sketch, her eyes filled with tears. "This is unbelievable," she whispered. "It's not just him. You captured everything." The young man nodded quietly. "It's the way he is right now. That's all." By now, the whispers of his parentage had reached almost everyone in the small street. People began to step back, taking in the scene. They realized they were watching not just a talented artist, but someone who embodied humility, care, and observation in every gesture. His fame, the legacy of his father, seemed almost irrelevant. What mattered was the human connection, the way he saw people, and the quiet magic he created through his sketches. Some people who had been skeptical or distant began to approach him, quietly asking if they could be drawn. Each time he responded with the same calm, polite humility. Each time he captured not just faces but the essence of the moment, the small human details that made life feel alive. A young boy tugged at his father's hand and whispered, "Do you think he's really famous?" The father smiled softly. "Maybe, but it doesn't matter right now. Look at what he's doing. Look at how he notices things most of us miss." As the afternoon wore on, a quiet sense of wonder settled over the street. People lingered, even those who hadn't intended to stop. Some simply watched. Others waited patiently, hoping for a chance to be captured in his sketches. The city felt different that day, slightly brighter, quieter, more alive, as if the attention he paid to life had rippled outward, touching everyone around him. Even those who had known of his father's fame admitted quietly to themselves that they had not expected this. They had imagined arrogance, attention-seeking, and grand gestures. Instead, they found humility, focus, and a deep human warmth. It was almost shocking to realize that someone so closely tied to greatness could be so ordinary in the best sense. Ordinary, yet extraordinary in the way he connected to people. A few journalists who had heard the whispers approached cautiously. "Are you the son of the famous painter?" One asked, notebook in hand. He nodded without looking up. "Yes," he said simply. "But why do you draw like this? Not in galleries? Not in exhibitions?" The journalist asked. He smiled faintly. "Galleries and exhibitions are fine for some people, but I want to capture life as it happens, not life as it is staged. People, moments, the ordinary. That's what matters to me." The journalist scribbled notes furiously, clearly impressed. "You have a gift," she said softly, "and a perspective most people will never understand." He nodded politely, then returned to his sketchpad, ignoring the growing attention. For him, the sketches were not about recognition or fame. They were about seeing, understanding, and giving people a reflection of themselves, a reminder that they mattered and that the small moments in life could be beautiful if someone paid attention. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the street, the young man packed up his materials. He gave sketches to those who had sat for him, thanking them quietly. Each person received their drawing with gratitude, surprise, and awe. Many whispered softly, "I will keep this forever," or "I never knew someone could see me like this." The quiet wonder lingered long after he left. People continued to talk in hushed tones, some snapping photos, some just staring at the sketches they had received. The small street for a few hours had become a place of magic, a place where ordinary moments were celebrated, where attention and care transformed the everyday into something unforgettable. Even as the city returned to its normal rhythm, the memory of him remained. People would remember the young man who drew them not as strangers or objects but as individuals with stories, small joys, and unique beauty. The whispers of his parentage would continue, but they no longer mattered. What mattered was what he had done. He had noticed, he had connected, and he had reminded people that life was full of moments worth seeing. He walked away quietly, blending into the city crowd once more. The street returned to its usual pace, the cafes resumed their chatter, and the fountain splashed in the golden light. But the impression he left was lasting, proof that sometimes the simplest acts done with care and attention can have the deepest impact. For him, it wasn't about fame. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the people, the moments, and the quiet art of noticing. And in that he found a happiness that no gallery or exhibition could ever match. The next morning felt different. The city was buzzing with life as usual, but there was an undercurrent of excitement that had grown since the previous days. People who had witnessed the young man's sketches spoke of him wherever they went, on buses, in cafes, in offices. Some had shown their sketches to friends and family. Others had posted pictures online. The fact that he was the son of a world-famous painter added to the fascination. But what truly held everyone's attention was the way he drew life itself, quietly and humbly. He walked through the city streets with his sketchpad tucked under his arm, moving at a measured pace. He didn't hurry, didn't rush. Every corner of the city felt alive with stories waiting to be noticed. The way sunlight fell across an old doorway, the gentle sway of laundry hanging from a balcony, the small gestures of people greeting each other on the street. He wanted to capture it all, to preserve these moments of life that often went unseen. Soon he arrived at a park he had never visited before. It was a large park with winding paths, tall trees, and patches of grass where children played and couples sat quietly. A fountain stood at its center, surrounded by benches where people relaxed. The young man found an empty bench and sat down, opening his sketchpad. He let his eyes wander, scanning for someone whose presence called to him. He noticed a man sitting under a tree, reading a newspaper, occasionally looking up to watch people passing by. A woman nearby sketched flowers in her notebook, seemingly lost in her own world. A group of children ran across the grass laughing, their energy filling the air. Each of these scenes offered a small story, a moment that could be captured. He began to sketch the man under the tree first. Carefully, he observed the lines of concentration on his face, the way he held the newspaper, the faint tilt of his head as he read. The pencil moved steadily, each stroke deliberate, as if the lines themselves carried the quiet energy of the scene. People began to notice him again. Some stopped to watch, curious about the young man drawing quietly on the bench. Whispers started circulating. Isn't that him? The painter's son? The one everyone has been talking about? A few children approached, intrigued by the movement of the pencil and the appearance of the sketch. Can you draw us? One of them asked hesitantly. He smiled softly. Of course, he said, gesturing for them to sit. Their laughter and excitement added energy to the sketches, and within moments, the young man had captured their joy, their movement, and the playful glint in their eyes. Parents watched from a distance, amazed at the way he noticed the smallest details, the way a hand twitched as a child laughed, the way sunlight reflected off hair, the way tiny feet barely touched the ground as they ran. It wasn't just skill. It was attention, presence, and respect for the people he drew.